When her husband passed away, Maggie thought her family would be the only support she had left. But just 3 weeks after the funeral, her own daughter gave her a cold ultimatum. Get a job or get out. In the quiet desperation of old age, Maggie was forced to do the unthinkable return to work just to survive. Before we dive into all of this, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Connecting with viewers across the world is a huge source of inspiration for us. When her husband died, Maggie Callahan thought the worst was over. She had buried the man she'd loved for 45 years, her best friend, her steady rock through every storm life had thrown at them. She thought grief would be the hardest part, that the days ahead would be filled with tears and quiet cups of tea in the house they'd built together, where memories lingered in every corner. What she didn't expect was the knockdown blow that came just 3 weeks later from her own daughter. It happened on a Monday afternoon. The funeral lilies were still wilting in their vases. Maggie stood in her small, sunlit kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, wearing the same black cardigan she'd worn to the graveside. Her hands trembled slightly, a dull ache in her knuckles reminding her that grief had weight not just on the heart, but on the body too. Vanessa walked in without knocking. She always did that now, let herself in, breezing through Maggie's door like she was walking into one of her listings. At 42, she was polished, composed, and tired of carrying what she called dead weight. Her voice, when she spoke, was crisp like ice cracking under pressure. "Mom, we need to talk." Maggie turned slowly, coffee cup in hand. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Vanessa set her designer purse on the counter with a snap. "This arrangement, it isn't working anymore." Maggie blinked, confused. "What arrangement?" "You living here," Vanessa said, arms folded. "I know Dad's gone, but I can't afford to support you. Not anymore." The cup slipped from Maggie's fingers and shattered on the tile floor. The coffee spread quickly in a brown puddle, seeping into the broken ceramic like it had nowhere else to go. "But this is my home," Maggie whispered, crouching down instinctively to gather the shards. Her knees creaked in protest. "No, Mom," Vanessa said. "It's my home now. Dad left everything to me, remember? The house is in my name. But I have Social Security," Maggie offered, voice fragile. "$800 a month. I can help." Vanessa laughed a short, humorless bark. "$800 doesn't even cover the power bill." Maggie stared at the floor, still holding the largest shard in her palm, her reflection distorted in its curve. "I've been thinking," Vanessa continued, now pulling out her phone. "There's this man, he needs a caregiver. Lives upstate. Very wealthy. You were a nurse, right? Before you had me?" "That was a lifetime ago," Maggie said softly. 40 years. Things have changed. I wouldn't know how to—" "It's not medical. Just companionship. Daily help. It pays well. Room and board included." Maggie looked up, her eyes searching her daughter's face for softness, for any sign of the little girl who used to hold her hand during thunderstorms. But all she saw was the polished businesswoman, composed, unyielding. "I've already set up the interview," Vanessa added. "It's tomorrow. And if I say no," Vanessa finally looked her mother in the eye, "then you'll have to find somewhere else to live." The words didn't land right away. They floated, slow and heavy, like snow in the air, beautiful, cold, impossible. Maggie stood, the piece of broken cup still in her hand, now cutting slightly into her palm. "You'd turn me out?" she asked, more stunned than angry. "I can't carry you forever," Vanessa said flatly. "I have my own family, my own bills, my own life." That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She sat in the guest room, once her sewing room, now a spare bed with a stiff mattress and a view of the garage. She stared out the window at the maple tree her husband had planted the year Vanessa was born. The leaves were turning gold, as they did every autumn, unapologetically beautiful even as they died. Was this what growing old meant? Being useful or being discarded? The next morning, she packed the bare essentials: 2 cardigans, her nursing license from 1974, and a photograph of her and her husband on their wedding day. She boarded a bus bound for a part of the state she'd never been to, wearing her best blouse and a brave face. When she stepped out in front of the Whitmore estate, her breath caught. The mansion looked like something out of a movie, all ivy and marble and silence. A long driveway curved through rows of perfectly trimmed hedges. It smelled of old money and untold stories. Her hand trembled as she rang the doorbell. At 68 years old, Margaret Callahan was applying for a job she hadn't done in 4 decades, to care for a man she'd never met, because her own daughter, the child she'd given everything for, had slammed the door behind her. She straightened her spine as the door opened. Whatever was coming next, she would face it with dignity. Because what else did she have left? The front door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Maggie blinked at the woman standing before her, tall, stern, mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair pinned in a tight bun and a navy blue suit that fit like armor. "You must be Mrs. Callahan," she said, her voice as polished as the marble floor behind her. "I'm Patricia Whitmore, house manager. Please come in." Maggie hesitated at the threshold, then stepped into a different world. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. The floor gleamed under her sensible shoes, and chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they made her dizzy. Oil paintings lined the walls, portraits of proud, unsmiling men and women, all with the same sharp cheekbones and cold blue eyes. Generations of Whitmores watching her enter their kingdom. Patricia didn't look back as she led Maggie down a corridor so long it could have been mistaken for a museum wing. Her heels clicked with military precision. "Mr. Whitmore is a private man. He doesn't tolerate lateness, inefficiency, or idle chatter. He's had several caregivers over the years. I hope you're made of stronger material." Maggie didn't answer. Her eyes were busy cataloging everything: the Persian rugs, the glass display cases, the occasional glimpse of manicured gardens through enormous windows. This house didn't just whisper wealth, it shouted it. "He requires help with most daily activities," Patricia continued. "He's paralyzed from the waist down. The accident was 5 years ago. The position includes room and board, a generous salary, and full use of the staff kitchen. You'll be staying in the East Wing, adjacent to his quarters." They stopped in front of a pair of tall, dark oak doors. Before Patricia opened them, she paused. "One more thing. Mr. Whitmore values privacy above all else. If he asks you a question, answer it honestly. If he doesn't, don't volunteer." Maggie nodded, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder to keep her hands from shaking. The doors opened, revealing a grand library that could have belonged to an old university. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound books. A fireplace crackled beneath a marble mantel, and by the tall windows, in the golden light of early afternoon, sat a man in a wheelchair. Henry Whitmore. His hair was silver, not gray thick, neatly parted. His features were still sharp, still powerful, the kind of face that must have made boardrooms fall silent when he entered. His eyes were piercingly blue, not the bright kind that sparkled, but the deep, unreadable kind that made you feel like you were being studied. He turned when he heard them enter. "Mr. Whitmore," Patricia said formally. "This is Margaret Callahan, the candidate we discussed." He looked at Maggie for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition? Surprise? Discomfort? She couldn't tell. "Please," he said, gesturing to a chair near the window. "Sit down." Maggie lowered herself carefully, adjusting her skirt to hide the trembling in her knees. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "You were a nurse?" "Many years ago," she replied. "Before I got married." "And now?" "My husband passed recently." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she murmured, eyes dropping to her lap. A beat of silence. Then, "Have we met before?" Madge's breath caught. "I don't believe so," she said too quickly. But something about the way he tilted his head, the way his eyes narrowed slightly, it unsettled her. There was a familiarity there, like a dream you half remembered. Something buried deep. "No," she said again, softer. "I don't think so." Henry Whitmore studied her for another few seconds before turning his chair slightly. "Why are you here, Mrs. Callahan?" A reasonable question. Why indeed? Because her daughter had turned her out. Because the world had grown cold and sharp, and there were no soft places left for women like her, widowed, old, expendable. Because at 68, she was sitting in front of a man who had more money than God, and her only assets were an outdated nursing license and a cardigan with a hole in the sleeve. But she couldn't say that. So instead, she said the truth. I believe in taking care of people. I always have. Something shifted in his expression just slightly. He nodded. That's rare. Patricia stepped forward. Shall I show Mrs. Callahan to her quarters? Henry raised a hand without looking at her. Number, give us a moment, please. Patricia's eyebrows twitched, but she obeyed. The doors closed behind her with a quiet click. Alone now. Maggie felt the silence between them stretch long and taut. Henry leaned forward slightly in his chair. How old are you, Mrs. Callahan? 68. And yet you're starting over. Maggie smiled faintly. I suppose I am. That takes grit. I don't know about that. Maybe just necessity. He was quiet again. Then he said, I need someone I can trust. Someone who won't pity me, gossip about me, or pretend to be cheerful while counting the minutes until they go home. I don't need a nurse. I need a person. Maggie met his eyes. I'm a person, she said simply. A breath passed between them. He extended his hand. Then welcome, Mrs. Callahan. She took it. His grip was warm, firm, deliberate, and when their fingers touched, she felt something strange like static, only deeper, something beneath the skin. She pulled her hand back quickly, unsure what it meant. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something neither of them had planned. That night, Maggie unpacked her single suitcase in a room the size of her old living room and bedroom combined. The bed was too big, the silence too perfect. She found herself wandering to the window, staring out over the gardens, wondering who this man really was. Henry Whitmore. Why had he looked at her like that? Why did his voice sound like something she'd once heard in a different lifetime? She lay awake long after midnight, listening to the wind tapping gently against the window. In another part of the house, Henry sat alone in the library, staring into the fire, a photograph open in his lap. A young woman in a yellow dress, laughing beside a boy with dark hair and eyes like his own. He hadn't seen her in nearly 5 decades, until today. And now, the past, long buried, long grieved, was walking his halls, wearing sensible shoes, and carrying a name he hadn't heard in years. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. The next morning, Maggie woke up before dawn, disoriented by the luxurious silence. In her own house, Vanessa's house now, the mornings were never quiet. There had always been the buzz of the heater kicking on, the creak of old floorboards, the hum of neighborhood life beyond the windows. Here, everything felt suspended in time, still, solemn, waiting. She dressed carefully in the uniform Patricia had left on a hanger in the closet. Navy slacks, a white blouse, low-heeled shoes. Her hair, now more silver than blonde, she pinned back in a simple twist. She looked like someone else. Someone smaller. By the time she reached the east wing, the house was stirring. Patricia gave her a tight nod as she passed, already holding a clipboard and murmuring instructions into an earpiece. Maggie was ushered into the breakfast room, where Henry was already seated at a long mahogany table, sipping black coffee and reading the morning paper like a king waiting for his court. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore, she said gently. His eyes flicked up from the paper, and for a moment, she thought he might not respond. Then he set the paper down and gestured to the seat across from him. Please, sit. She obeyed, folding her hands on the table. A quiet pause settled between them. Do you prefer Margaret or Maggie? He asked, reaching for his toast. She blinked, surprised. Maggie's fine. Everyone calls me that. Not everyone, I imagine. She smiled faintly. Number just everyone who knows me. There was a glint of something in his eyes. Something curious, something old. Then Maggie it is. The conversation drifted toward neutral ground. His care schedule, medications, meal preferences. But every now and then his gaze would linger a little too long, like he was trying to decipher her. At one point, as she was arranging the fruit on his breakfast tray, he said almost casually, Hilda is a German name, isn't it? She stilled. Maggie, she corrected gently, not looking up. He gave the faintest nod. Of course. But something in his tone said he wasn't asking out of curiosity. After breakfast, while Henry wheeled himself to his study, Maggie returned to her quarters, her thoughts buzzing louder than the birds outside her window. There was no reason for him to bring up that name. Hilda. No one had called her that in decades, not since she was a girl. Unless... Her heart pounded. She knelt beside the last box she hadn't yet unpacked, the one Vanessa had practically thrown at her while she was being shoved out of her own kitchen. Inside were mostly practical things. Her Bible, a half-finished Afghan, a tin of buttons that once belonged to her mother. And buried beneath all of it, wrapped in faded floral tissue, were 2 photo albums. She hadn't looked at them since Dante's funeral. Not really. She'd carried them from house to house like sacred relics, too afraid of the grief they held. Now, her fingers found the older of the 2, the one with the cracked blue leather cover and the spine so worn it barely held. She opened it slowly, pages sticking together like they too had grown old in silence. There she was, a younger version of herself, 19, maybe 20, laughing, full of life, wearing that ridiculous yellow sundress with the crooked hem she'd sewn herself. And next to her, the boy with the dark hair, the devastating smile, and the deep blue eyes that had once convinced her the world was worth taking a chance on. Terry. Not Henry Whitmore, real estate mogul. Not Mr. Whitmore, the man who drank his coffee with military precision and spoke like his words were rationed. Terry. The boy who once swore he'd marry her after he made something of himself. Her throat tightened. She turned page after page, the county fair. Their first Christmas, the lake where he'd carved their initials into an oak tree. The dance in her tiny apartment where he'd twirled her until she couldn't stop laughing. The day he left, she found the train station photo, her hands cupping his face. Tears in her eyes, his suitcase beside them like an omen. She could still hear his voice. I'll come back for you. 2 years, tops. I promise. But 2 years had stretched into silence. Letters stopped. Rumors flew. And eventually, she'd met Dante Gentle. Dependable Dante, who never promised the world, but always showed up for dinner. She turned to the last page and found the letter. Still folded neatly. Still written in the same confident slant. My dearest Hilda, I've done it. Everything I promised. I'm coming home next month, and then we can finally begin our life together. Her wedding to Dante had already taken place when it arrived. Too late. The ring Terry had given her, a simple silver band she'd returned by mail. No note, too ashamed to explain. She pressed the letter to her chest and let the memories rise. The joy, the heartbreak, the guilt that had never quite gone away. A knock at the door startled her. She quickly slid the album back into the box, tucked it beneath the bed. "Come in!" she called, wiping her eyes. Patricia stepped inside, expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you in the conservatory." Maggie nodded, smoothing her blouse. She found Henry alone, bathed in late morning sunlight. The conservatory was breathtaking, a glass cathedral filled with green life and warm air. Ferns draped from wrought iron stands. Orchids bloomed in hanging pots. And somewhere, a fountain burbled softly. He looked up when she entered. "You were quiet at breakfast," he said. She smiled lightly. "So were you." They sat in silence for a moment, the air filled with the soft sounds of water and birds. Then he asked, "Have you ever been to Millridge?" Her heart stopped. Millridge. The tiny town where she'd grown up, where she'd met Terry, where they'd planned their future on a park bench by the lake. She cleared her throat. "I might have passed through." "There was a diner," he said softly. "Marlowe's best cherry pie in 5 counties. And a lake where teenagers used to swim, even when the signs said not to." She nodded slowly. "I remember." He turned to look at her fully now, something raw in his eyes. "I used to know a girl there. She wore a yellow dress she made herself. Her name was Hilda." Maggie closed her eyes. "You've remembered," she whispered. He never forgot. The space between them dissolved. There, beneath the filtered autumn light, time bent. They weren't 68 and 71. They were 20 again, wild and foolish and heartbreakingly in love. "I came back for you," he said. "I kept my promise. But you were gone. I thought you forgot me," she said, her voice trembling. "I waited, and then I gave up." "I never stopped writing," he said. "My business partner thought you'd distract me. He intercepted the letters. By the time I found out, you were married. A silence bloomed between them, thick with decades of what-ifs. She reached for his hand, and he didn't flinch. I thought I'd buried you in my past, she said. But you were just waiting in my future. Henry gave a soft, broken laugh. That sounds like something I would have said. They sat like that, two hands intertwined, surrounded by glass and sunlight and time, remembering the love that once was and wondering what might still be. For the next few days, Maggie moved through the halls of the Whitmore estate like someone walking between two worlds, one foot in the present, the other forever tangled in the past. Her duties remained the same. She prepared Henry's meals, managed his medication, and kept his schedule in order. But something had changed. There was a different weight in the air now, a tenderness in how he spoke to her, an ache in how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She saw it most clearly on Tuesday evening, after dinner. They had taken to eating together in the smaller breakfast room, a space tucked away from the grandeur of the main dining hall. It had soft lighting, a round oak table, and a view of the rose garden. Maggie was slicing strawberries for dessert when Henry spoke. I kept the ring, you know. Her knife froze mid-slice. The silver one, he continued. The one I gave you in the glove compartment of my father's truck. The one you sent back. Maggie swallowed hard. I couldn't keep it. I was married. I know. I never blamed you, but I never threw it away either. He wheeled his chair back slightly and reached into the side pocket of his wool cardigan. With careful fingers, he placed a small velvet box on the table between them. Maggie stared at it for a long moment before reaching out. Her fingers brushed the top like it might burn her. She opened it slowly. Inside, the ring was just as she remembered, simple, narrow, a tiny engraved heart on the inner band. She'd worn it for almost 2 years, never taking it off, even while she slept. It had once left a faint tan line on her finger, a mark she hadn't noticed fading until years later. She looked up, her throat thick. Why are you showing me this now? Because I don't want it to stay a relic of what we lost. I want it to be a reminder of what we still might find. Her eyes welled with tears. Henry, she whispered, you don't know who I am anymore. I know enough, he said gently. And I'm not the man I was either. Maybe we don't need to go back. Maybe we just start where we are. Maggie closed the box and slid it back toward him. Not yet, she said softly. Let's not rush what took 48 years to come back around. He nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. Fair enough. They sat in silence, the strawberries forgotten, the air between them buzzing with possibility. But while something new and fragile was blooming between them, something darker was brewing just outside the gates. Vanessa. It began with a phone call. Maggie was in the kitchen late one evening, stirring a pot of soup while Patricia reviewed a delivery invoice nearby. The house was quiet, the way it always was after sunset. The hum of the refrigerator, the loudest sound. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Vanessa. She hesitated, then answered. Hi, sweetheart. The voice on the other end was sharp. Why didn't you tell me you were working for him? Maggie's heart sank. Vanessa. I just got off the phone with Mrs. Carpenter from church. She saw you at the co-op grocery store yesterday, pushing a cart next to a man in a wheelchair, said he looked intimate. Maggie swallowed. We were shopping for baking ingredients. You were laughing, Mom, holding his hand. People are talking, so let them. Vanessa's voice dropped into a hiss. Are you sleeping with him? Maggie gripped the edge of the counter. That is none of your business. It is my business if you're humiliating our family. Our family? Maggie's voice rose. You mean the family that tossed me out after your father's funeral and told me to fend for myself? There was silence on the other end. I didn't throw you out, Vanessa muttered. I gave you options. No, Vanessa. You gave me an ultimatum. I was grieving. So was I, Maggie snapped. But I didn't use my grief as a reason to abandon you. Another silence. Then, he's using you, Mom. You're vulnerable. He's rich. That's a dangerous combination. Maggie laughed bitterly. You think I'm after his money? I think he might think you are. The words landed like a slap. Maggie took a deep breath. Vanessa, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same woman you grew up with. I'm tired of apologizing for needing love, or help, or a place in this world. You're being reckless, Vanessa said coldly. And when this all blows up in your face, don't expect me to clean it up. The line went dead. Maggie stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone, her soup burning slightly behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't call back. Instead, she stirred the pot slowly and whispered, "Let it burn." The next day, Henry wheeled into the conservatory while Maggie was watering the orchids. "You spoke with her," he said, not needing to ask. She nodded. "She thinks I'm being used." "She's not entirely wrong," he said softly. "I'm using you. For hope. For company. For reasons to wake up in the morning." She turned around, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "I'm using you too," she said. "For safety. For purpose. For someone to talk to after dinner." He smiled. "Well, at least we're honest." She moved to sit beside him, taking his hand gently. "What happens next?" she asked. Henry looked out through the glass walls to the garden beyond, now dotted with the orange and red leaves of deep autumn. "Maybe nothing," he said. "Maybe everything." She nodded, understanding that at their age it was enough to simply keep choosing each other moment by moment, day by day. And maybe, if they were lucky, the past could become the foundation for a future neither of them ever expected. Vanessa arrived without warning. It was a Friday afternoon, the sky smeared in thick, gray clouds that threatened a storm. Maggie had just finished organizing Henry's medication tray for the weekend when Patricia appeared at the doorway of the study with a look she rarely wore uncertainty. "There's a visitor for you," she said slowly. "Your daughter." Maggie set the last pill bottle down with a soft click. Her heart began to thrum, not out of fear, but out of an old, aching exhaustion. "Where is she?" she asked. "The foyer. And she's not happy." Henry looked up from his reading. "Do you want me there?" Maggie considered, then nodded. "Please." Together, they moved into the grand foyer, Henry wheeling slowly beside her. Maggie with her chin lifted and her cardigan drawn tight over her shoulders. Vanessa stood near the entrance, clutching her purse like it was armor. She wore black heels, a dark blazer, and that thin line of lipstick she always applied when preparing for confrontation. "This place is ridiculous," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Who needs 10 chandeliers in a single house?" "Hello to you too," Maggie replied calmly. Vanessa's eyes landed on Henry, and her smile stretched thin. "Mr. Whitmore, what a surprise. I assumed you paid people to keep my mother company, not to entertain her personally." Henry didn't flinch. "Miss Callahan, I've heard a lot about you. Some of it, regrettably accurate." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "I came to speak to my mother alone." "She's not going anywhere without me," Henry said. Maggie touched his arm. "It's all right. I'll speak with her in the conservatory." Henry gave her a long look, then nodded. "I'll be just down the hall." Maggie turned to her daughter. "Follow me." They walked in silence through the marble corridors until they reached the conservatory, the same room where Maggie had learned Henry had remembered everything. Vanessa stepped in and scoffed at the beauty of it. "Of course, this is where you spend your time, pretending you're someone else." "I'm not pretending," Maggie said quietly. "I'm remembering who I used to be before I gave everything to everyone else." Vanessa's eyes blazed. "Is that supposed to be a dig at me?" Maggie sighed. "It's not a dig. It's the truth." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Do you realize how this looks? You're practically living with a man 2 months after Dad died. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I know what you're saying," Maggie replied. "That I'm reckless. That I'm embarrassing you. That I'm making choices you don't approve of." "Because you are," Vanessa snapped. "This man is wealthy, vulnerable, and alone. You wormed your way into his house and—" "Stop." Maggie's voice was steel now. Vanessa blinked. "I came here because you gave me no choice. You told me to find a job or get out. And now that I've found something more than a job, something meaningful, you come charging in like I've committed a crime." "You're living with him," Vanessa spat. "You don't even know him." Maggie's voice softened. "I know him better than I know anyone." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. You don't have to understand it, Vanessa. You just have to accept that it's not your life to manage." Vanessa shook her head. "He'll hurt you, or you'll hurt him. Either way, someone ends up ruined." "We're not children," Maggie said. We know what we're doing. Do you? Vanessa said, voice rising. Or are you just clinging to the first hand that reached for you when I let go? Maggie froze. The words landed too close to the truth. I didn't let go, Vanessa continued. Quieter now. I needed space. I needed to breathe. You were everywhere, your grief, your expectations, your sadness. I was drowning, Mom. And I panicked. Maggie's eyes filled. But she didn't look away. You could have said that. You could have just asked for help. I didn't know how, Vanessa whispered. There it was, the crack in her voice. The same one Maggie had heard when Vanessa was little and tried to lie about something that scared her. You were angry, Maggie said. But not at me. Vanessa nodded slowly. I found letters. From Dad. To someone named Jennifer. Dated before he died. 2 years' worth. The air shifted. Maggie sat down. Slowly. As if the weight of that truth had pressed into her bones. I didn't know, she said quietly. I did, Vanessa said. I knew before the funeral. I didn't know how to tell you. Maggie closed her eyes. The betrayal settled in her like dust. Not sudden, not sharp, but a quiet confirmation of something she had never allowed herself to consider. All that time, she whispered, and I thought he was slipping away because of the illness. He was, but also because he'd already left in some ways. They sat in silence. Finally, Maggie asked, Is that why you pushed me out? Vanessa nodded. I was so angry. I didn't know where to put it. And when I saw you still holding on, still clinging to the image of your perfect marriage, I wanted to shake you, to scream that it was all a lie. It wasn't all a lie, Maggie said. Not everything. I know, Vanessa said. But enough of it was. She looked away, then back at her mother. So maybe this thing with Henry. Maybe I overreacted. Maggie raised her eyebrows. Vanessa sighed. Okay, I definitely overreacted. A pause. Vanessa stepped forward, awkwardly. I don't understand it. I probably never will. But I don't want to lose you. Not again. Maggie studied her daughter's face, the hard lines of adulthood softening, the pain around her eyes that mirrored her own. Then stop fighting me, she said gently. Let me be happy, even if it looks nothing like what you imagined. Vanessa nodded. I'm sorry, Mom. Maggie stood, opened her arms, and held her daughter for the first time since Dante's funeral. In the garden outside, a gust of wind shook the trees, sending red and yellow leaves tumbling like blessings from the sky. The next morning, the light in the conservatory was soft and golden. Maggie stood by the window, watching a pair of cardinals hop between branches of the dogwood tree just beyond the glass. Their feathers flashed red like fire through the cool air. She had barely slept. Not from regret, no, not that, but from the sheer weight of release. She and Vanessa hadn't solved everything the night before. There were years of silence between them, habits that wouldn't change overnight. But they had cracked something open. That was enough. For now. She heard the wheels of Henry's chair before she saw him. I heard the front door close late last night, he said, rolling into the room beside her. Did she stay long? Maggie nodded. A couple of hours. We cried, we yelled, we hugged, just the usual. He gave her a dry smile. Sounds productive. It was, she said, turning toward him. And she apologized. Henry's eyebrows lifted slightly. That might be more impressive than the yelling. Maggie laughed. Then, after a pause, she added, She knows about us. His face shifted slightly. And? She didn't approve, Maggie said. But she didn't storm out either. That's progress. Henry looked out at the garden. Do you think she'll make trouble? She's not the same girl who pushed me out of her house, Maggie replied. I think she's trying. I think she's scared. But I also think she wants to understand. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his lap blanket and pulled something out. The small velvet box. Again, Maggie stared at it. I know what you said before, he said. That it was too soon. That we should take our time. But I've lived alone for too long, Maggie. And I don't want to waste another day pretending that what we have isn't real. Her breath caught. He opened the box. The silver ring gleamed softly inside, worn smooth over time. its tiny engraved heart still visible. I'm not asking for a grand wedding. I'm not asking for legal documents or lawyers or announcements in the paper. I'm just asking you to say yes to this. To me. To whatever time we have left. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, picked up the ring with trembling fingers, and slipped it onto the third finger of her left hand, the finger that had once belonged to Dante's gold band, the finger that now trembled beneath a lifetime of love and loss. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Henry. His shoulders dropped in relief, and for the first time since she'd known him, Maggie saw him smile. Really smile. The kind of smile that lit up his whole face. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They just sat there, watching the cardinals through the glass. Two old hearts that had somehow found their way back to each other in a world that had tried to scatter them. The days that followed passed in a gentle rhythm like the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet room. Fall deepened, and the leaves began to fall in earnest. Maggie and Henry spent their mornings reading, their afternoons in the conservatory, their evenings by the fireplace listening to jazz records that reminded them both of who they once were. Patricia, to her credit, adjusted to the new arrangement, with only a few raised eyebrows and tightly controlled expressions. If she had reservations about Maggie wearing the silver ring, she didn't voice them. "I once thought you'd die alone in this house, sir," she said bluntly one evening while delivering his tea. "I'm glad to be wrong." Henry chuckled. "It only took me half a century." She smirked. Well, some men are slower learners. But not everyone accepted the shift so gracefully. 3 days after Maggie said yes, a letter arrived. A formal one-cream envelope, gold seal, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, typed in clinical font. A request for a meeting. From Vanessa, at Henry's estate. Face to face. "I don't like it," Henry said, folding the letter back into its envelope. "This smells like legal trouble." "She wouldn't sue her own mother," Maggie said, but even as the words left her lips, doubt crept in. "She's a realtor," Henry said. "She knows how to smile while closing doors." Still, they agreed to the meeting. "I want this settled," Maggie said. "One way or another." Vanessa arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and heels that clicked against the tile like accusations. Her makeup was flawless, her posture perfect, but her face was pale and drawn. Patricia led her into the study, where Henry sat behind his wide mahogany desk, and Maggie beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me," Vanessa said, settling across from them. Henry didn't speak. He simply nodded, a stone of a man waiting to hear the weather forecast. Vanessa looked between them. "I came because I've done a lot of thinking." Maggie tensed. Vanessa continued. "At first, I thought this whole thing was a mistake. A vulnerable woman, my mother, getting too close to a man who didn't know her. But I was wrong. About both of you." Maggie blinked. "You were?" Vanessa nodded. "I went through Dad's papers. I found the letters to that other woman. And I realized, maybe you weren't as happy as I always assumed." Maggie stared at her. "I blamed you for moving on too fast," Vanessa continued. "But maybe I was angry because I couldn't move at all." Henry glanced at Maggie, but said nothing. Vanessa turned to him. "And you," she said. "I don't know what you were to my mother back then, and honestly, I don't need to. But I can see what you are to her now, and that's enough." Maggie felt her throat close up. Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a thin envelope, not legal, not sealed, just handwritten. "This is a letter," she said, setting it on the desk. "I wrote it yesterday. I didn't know if I'd have the courage to say all this aloud. But I want you to have it. Both of you." She stood. "I'm not perfect," she said, "but I'm trying. And I'd like to be invited to the wedding. If there's going to be one." Maggie reached out and took her daughter's hand. There already was. Vanessa's eyes widened. "A private one," Henry said. "No announcements, no champagne, just us. And Patricia, who stood in as witness." Vanessa's mouth twisted, half disapproval, half amusement. Of course she did. Then, after a pause, "Congratulations." She leaned down, kissed Maggie's cheek quickly, almost shyly, and turned to go. Before she reached the door, she looked back. "You two are either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." Henry grinned. Maybe both. Vanessa nodded once, and then she was gone. That night, Maggie stood alone in the conservatory, the stars just beginning to pierce the velvet sky. In her hand, she held Vanessa's letter, still unopened. She would read it later, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. For now, it was enough to know that it existed, that her daughter had tried. Behind her, Henry's voice drifted softly through the open doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I have this dance?" She turned. He was waiting in his wheelchair, a record player spinning something old and slow in the background. She crossed the room, took his hands, and let the music do the rest. They didn't move far, just a slow, swaying rhythm. But in the echoing space of that glass-walled room, with the world hushed around them and autumn clinging to the last gold leaves on the trees, it felt like a waltz for the ages. And this time, they weren't dancing toward the past. They were dancing into whatever came next, together. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. Eureka Springs on a Sunday morning looked like something out of a vintage postcard, cobblestone streets damp from a light rain, rows of Victorian homes wrapped in climbing ivy, and church bells echoing through crisp, golden air. Henry insisted they go. "It's time," he said simply, adjusting his tie in the mirror while Maggie buttoned the last pearl on her blouse. "To what?" she asked. "To stop hiding." Maggie glanced at her reflection, silver hair pinned back neatly, soft blush on her cheeks, a navy dress that she hadn't worn since Dante's memorial. It fit looser now, but her posture was straighter, and there was a silver ring on her finger. That mattered more than anything else. They arrived at the stone chapel just before the first hymn. Henry maneuvered his wheelchair up the sloped entrance with Maggie by his side. Heads turned. Some polite smiles. Some barely masked surprise. A few hushed whispers. Eureka Springs was a small town, and Henry Whitmore hadn't been seen in church for years, not since the accident, and never with a woman beside him. The pews were nearly full. But when the pastor saw them, he stepped down from the pulpit and gestured gently toward the front. "This way, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. We've reserved space for you." Maggie blinked. He said it so naturally, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, that it nearly stole her breath. She wasn't sure if he had read it in the paper or simply guessed from the way she walked beside Henry now, but in that moment, it felt right. They settled in the front pew, Maggie smoothing her skirt, Henry folding his hands in his lap. The music began. Familiar hymns. Warm voices. Maggie glanced sideways and saw Henry quietly mouthing the words. His voice didn't rise, but his eyes shone with something deep, not nostalgia, not reverence. Something like peace. For 20 minutes she forgot the whispers. Forgot Vanessa's objections. Forgot the years they had lost. In that chapel, surrounded by strangers and wooden beams, she felt something settle into place. Until the end of the service. The final prayer had barely ended when an older woman, neatly dressed, pearls at her neck, approached them with a warm but cautious smile. "Henry," she said, with a tone that suggested she'd once known him very well. "It's been too long." "Mildred," Henry replied politely. "It has." She turned to Maggie, her eyes scanning from the ring to the face, cataloging the story. "And this must be my wife," Henry said before she could finish. Mildred blinked. "Of course," she replied after a moment. "Lovely to meet you, dear. I must admit, it's a surprise. We all assumed." Maggie smiled gently. "Assumptions can be misleading." Mildred laughed lightly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, it's never too late for new beginnings." She moved on, her perfume lingering behind her like judgment wrapped in rosewater. Maggie turned to Henry. "Do you regret it yet?" "Not for a second. I do appreciate how she called me dear while mentally filing a scandal report." Henry grinned. "Mildred has never liked being out of the loop. She'll have the whole town updated before noon." Maggie squeezed his hand. "Let them talk." "They will," he said. "They always do." They left the chapel to a mix of curious stares and cautious nods. But Maggie held her head high, Henry's hand in hers, and for once, she didn't feel small under the weight of other people's eyes. She felt whole. That afternoon, They returned home to find the mailbox overflowing with envelopes, most addressed to Henry, some addressed to Mrs. Whitmore for the first time. Among them was a thick white envelope from a law office in Little Rock. Henry frowned. I don't recognize the name. He opened it slowly while Maggie poured tea in the sitting room. Inside was a short letter and a copy of an old will. Maggie watched his expression shift from curiosity to confusion and, finally, to something darker. What is it? She asked, setting the teapot down. He held up the document. My brother's estate. He passed 6 months ago. We weren't close. I didn't know you had a brother. Half-brother. We shared a father, not much else. He scanned the letter again. He left me everything. But there's a clause. A clause? Henry looked up, eyes stormy now. If I choose to contest it, I'll need to appear in probate court. But if I accept it quietly, I inherit. Maggie tilted her head. Is that a bad thing? Henry exhaled. He was a cruel man, bitter and spiteful. I suspect this is his final jab, forcing me to carry what he could never enjoy. He held up the letter. It says here the estate includes several properties and a foundation I didn't know existed. Maggie stepped forward. You don't have to decide today. Henry's voice was distant. I don't want his money, but I don't want it to be wasted either. She touched his shoulder. Then maybe you make something good out of it. He turned to her, studying her face like he did that first day. You always say the right thing. No, she said gently. I just say what you already know. That night, Henry wrote a letter of acceptance to the law firm, not for the wealth, but for the chance to redirect something bitter into something healing. I'll donate the properties to housing charities, he said, tapping his pen, and put the foundation towards scholarships. Something clean. Something that makes sense. Maggie smiled. A legacy worth leaving. They sat together by the fireplace, the autumn wind tapping softly at the windows. Outside, the leaves continued to fall, and inside, something continued to grow steady, quiet, and rooted in the kind of love that knew how to weather storms. The first time Maggie saw her, it was through the front window. She had been trimming the dahlias by the garden wall when Patricia stepped out onto the veranda, her heels sharp against the stone steps. A sleek black car pulled up to the circular driveway tinted windows, glossy like polished obsidian. From the back seat stepped a woman in her early 60s, tall and poised, with pale blonde hair in a neat bob and a coat the color of champagne. Even from a distance, Maggie felt the ripple in the air, a kind of tension that didn't belong in the autumn stillness. She couldn't hear the words, but the posture said enough. Patricia greeted her stiffly. The woman offered a tight smile and handed over a card. Then, quite deliberately, she looked toward the house and met Maggie's gaze. The eye contact was brief, but piercing as if she were measuring her. By the time Maggie set down the shears and came around to the front, the car was already gone, and Patricia was walking back inside, frowning. Who was that? Maggie asked. Patricia hesitated. Then, an old associate of Mr. Whitmore's from his company days. Maggie raised an eyebrow. She came a long way just to drop off a business card. She asked for an appointment, Patricia said. She was insistent. Did she say her name? Patricia hesitated again. Eleanor Sloane. The name landed in Maggie's chest like a stone. She didn't know why it rattled her. Maybe it was the way Patricia said it. Maybe it was the look the woman had given her through the glass. Does Henry know? He will. But when Maggie told him later that afternoon, he went quiet in a way she hadn't seen before. He closed his book, removed his glasses, and stared out the window for a long, measured moment. I didn't think she'd come here, he said. Who is she? He exhaled through his nose. My former business partner. Decades ago. Former, as in we built the company together. Before I bought her out, Maggie sat beside him waiting. She wanted expansion. I wanted sustainability. She wanted global. I wanted people. We disagreed. It turned ugly. Ugly how? She accused me of stealing her vision. I accused her of selling out. Lawyers got involved. But in the end, I gave her what she asked for. A full buyout. Generous. Final. And now she's here? Henry nodded. Which means she wants something. Maggie leaned forward. What did she mean to you? He turned to her, then eyes steady. We were close. Once. But not in the way you're thinking. I'm not thinking anything, Maggie said softly. I'm just listening. She was brilliant, hard, driven. The kind of woman who built empires while men underestimated her. We made a good team until we didn't. And after the fallout, we never spoke again. And now? Henry shrugged. Now she's 63 and probably bored. Or lonely. Or both. Or still angry. He nodded. That too. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Do you want to see her? Number. But his voice didn't have the sharp edge she expected. It was something softer. Sadder. She saw you, Maggie said. In the garden. She looked right at me. Henry's jaw shifted. Then she came for a reason. 2 days later, Eleanor returned. This time, she came inside. Patricia led her to the conservatory where Maggie and Henry were reading. Maggie had expected heels and perfume and ice. She hadn't expected elegance. Simplicity. The kind of woman who could walk into a glass room and make it feel like her own without touching a thing. Maggie, Henry said quietly, would you mind? She looked at him. He didn't ask again. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and nodded at Eleanor. Nice to meet you. Eleanor gave her a small, unreadable smile. Likewise. Then Maggie left the room, not because she had been dismissed, but because she knew when a room belonged to a past that wasn't hers. She sat in the library, thumbing through a book she couldn't absorb, waiting for the sounds of voices, footsteps, the echo of a door opening. But nothing came. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. When she finally heard the soft thud of Eleanor's heels retreating down the corridor, Maggie rose and moved to the hallway. She saw the woman standing in the foyer, slipping on black gloves with practiced grace. Eleanor paused when she noticed Maggie approaching. Can I ask you something? Maggie said. Eleanor tilted her head. Of course. Why now? The older woman smiled, but it wasn't cruel. It was tired. Because I heard a rumor that Henry Whitmore had fallen in love again, she said. And I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Maggie didn't reply. He's changed, Eleanor said. But not in the ways I thought he would. I'm not here to change him, Maggie said gently. I know. Eleanor looked down at her gloves, adjusting a strap. That's why it's working. Then she turned, stepped into the waiting car, and disappeared down the winding drive. That night, Henry said little. He sipped his tea, read a few pages, watched the fire burn. Then, just before bed, he said, She asked if I was happy. And what did you say? I said yes. For the first time in a very long time. Maggie crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. She took his hand, kissed his knuckles. She's not coming back, he said. That was goodbye. Maggie nodded. Was it hard? She asked. He looked at her. Really looked. No, he said. But it was necessary. She stood, pulled him gently toward the bedroom. Because some chapters, even the ones written in ink, were meant to be closed, not erased, not forgotten, but laid to rest. So the real story could begin. Let's go somewhere, Henry said one morning, while Patricia helped him into his cardigan. Just you and me. Maggie looked up from her crossword, confused. Where? He smiled. To where we left things unfinished. It took her a full moment to realize what he meant. Pine Hollow? Henry nodded. We owe it to the past. To ourselves. Maggie hesitated. She hadn't stepped foot in Pine Hollow since the summer before her wedding. A town too small for secrets, too full of echoes. But something in Henry's eyes not pleading, not force, just quiet certainty made her nod. All right, she said softly. Let's go home. They drove down on a Tuesday. Henry refused a driver. He wanted the silence of the road, the trees whipping by like time reversing itself. Maggie packed sandwiches, soft ginger cookies, and a thermos of sweet tea. They played old records on the car's Bluetooth speaker. Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Simon, and Garfunkel. Henry dozed between tracks, and Maggie watched the road with both hands on the wheel and her heart somewhere between now and then. By afternoon, the highway narrowed into country roads. Fields replaced strip malls. Pine trees gave the town its name tall, whispering, and so familiar it made Maggie's chest ache. Pine Hollow looked the same, and not at all. The gas station still stood at the edge of town, though the sign was newer. The church on Willow Street had fresh paint. The bakery was gone, replaced by a yoga studio. But the old cafe? Still there. Same wood shingles. Same leaning porch. Maggie parked out front and turned off the engine. Henry looked at her. "You ready?" he asked. She smiled. "Number. But let's do it anyway." Inside, the cafe smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and a hint of lemon just like it had 5 decades ago. The floor creaked underfoot. Booths lined the windows. The waitress looked up, surprised to see 2 silver-haired strangers walk in and take a seat by the corner. Maggie ran her fingers along the tabletop. "I sat here," she whispered. "The day I told you I couldn't see you again." Henry nodded, and I sat here, thinking you'd change your mind. She looked at him. I almost did. The waitress arrived, cheerful. "Welcome in. What can I get you two?" Henry looked at Maggie. "What did we order that day?" "Cherry pie and hot tea," she said without hesitation. "Make it 2, Henry told the waitress. When she left, the silence between them wasn't heavy, just filled with the soft hum of memory. "I wore a yellow dress," Maggie said. "The one with the lace collar. You said it made me look like sunlight." Henry chuckled. "You cried through the entire pie. You didn't touch yours. I was trying not to beg you to stay." She reached for his hand now, laying her fingers over his. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "For Dante. For my parents. For everyone but me." Henry nodded slowly. "I know. I loved you. Even then." He squeezed her hand gently. "I never doubted it." Their tea arrived. Steam curled between them. The cherry pie glistened under the lights. A little too red. A little too perfect, like time itself had tried to make peace. Henry took a bite first. "Still good," he said. Maggie laughed. "Still too sweet." They sat and ate, and for the first time in 48 years, there was no bitterness in the sugar. Afterward, they walked slowly down Main Street, past the old record store, now a pet supply shop, the movie house, now a hardware store, and the bench outside the post office where Henry had kissed her for the first time. "I was so nervous," he said, stopping beside it. "Your hands were shaking. So were yours. I thought the world would fall apart if anyone saw us." She smiled. It kind of did. They stood there for a while, letting the wind move through them. Then Henry asked, "Do you want to visit the cemetery?" Maggie didn't hesitate. Yes. They drove a mile out to Hollowview Cemetery, tucked behind the hills. Dante's grave was on the left side, under a birch tree. Maggie walked slowly toward it, carrying a small bouquet of lilies, white and soft like forgiveness. She knelt. The stone hadn't changed. Dante Callahan, 1948, 2022. Beloved husband and father. Always forward. Maggie traced the name with her fingertip. "I didn't stop loving you," she whispered. "I just started loving myself, too." She placed the flowers and stood. Henry waited by the car, giving her space. She walked back, arms wrapped around her middle. "I feel lighter," she said. Henry nodded. "That's what closure feels like." They stayed in a small bed and breakfast that night, overlooking Pine Lake. The air was cold. The sheets smelled of lavender. Henry fell asleep early, but Maggie sat by the window watching the moonlight ripple on the water. She thought of her life, all the years that felt like survival, not living. All the ways she had folded herself into other people's expectations, and all the pieces she was finally reclaiming. For the first time in decades, she didn't wonder what life could have been. She simply thanked God for what it had become. They returned to Eureka Springs on a cloudy Thursday, the air thick with the promise of rain. Patricia met them at the front door, holding an umbrella in one hand and a yellow envelope in the other. "This arrived 2 days ago," she said, handing it to Maggie. It was tucked in a stack of old estate papers from Pine Hollow. Someone must have forwarded it to the firm after the probate process. Maggie turned it over. No return address. Faded stamp. Postmarked. July 1975. Her breath caught. Henry, beside her, had already frozen. He recognized the handwriting. And so did she. I think, he said softly, that might be the letter I wrote you after you left. They didn't speak as they entered the house. The envelope sat heavy in Maggie's hand, like a heartbeat that had waited too long to be heard. She placed it on the kitchen table. Henry pulled out a chair, and they stared at it. Neither reached for it right away. It was never delivered? Maggie finally whispered. Henry shook his head. I gave it to a friend who said he'd hand it to your sister. I never followed up. I guess I didn't want to know if you ignored it. And I guess my sister never mentioned it. Maggie's voice was tight, small. They were no longer in their 70s, not in that moment. They were 20-something again, hurt and unsure, waiting for the other to blink. Maggie slowly tore the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The ink had faded slightly, but Henry's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, slanted, written in a different lifetime. She began to read aloud. Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't chase you down at the bus station like I planned. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I thought you deserved peace. But I can't let you go without saying this. You didn't ruin anything. You didn't betray me. You chose what you believed was right, and I may not understand it, but I will never hate you for it. If there's a version of the world where we get another chance, even if it's in 10 years or 50, I hope you'll remember that I loved you every day since the first day. And I always will. Be kind to yourself, sunshine. Henry. By the time she reached the end, her hands were shaking. Henry looked away, blinking fast. You wrote that, after I disappeared? He nodded. I went to your parents' house, he said. But you were gone. I left the letter and told myself I tried. Maggie folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. I would have come back, she whispered. If I'd read this then, I would have come back. Henry didn't speak. He simply reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. I know. That night, they didn't listen to music. They didn't talk much. They simply sat together, Henry's hand in Maggie's. The letter opened between them like an old scar no longer bleeding, but still tender. I always wondered why you let me go so easily, she murmured. I didn't, he replied. I just let you think I did. She looked at him. I thought you moved on, she said. Found someone else. There were other people, he said, but never anyone who made me forget you. Her voice trembled. We lost so much time. He leaned forward, kissed the back of her hand. We still have now. In the following days, something shifted between them, not distance, not discomfort, but something quieter. A sense of mourning for the youth they had once wasted apart. They still laughed, still read together, still walked the gardens when the weather allowed. But occasionally, Maggie would find herself staring out the window, wondering what her life might have been if that letter had reached her. And Henry, in his study, would sometimes open a drawer and stare at old photos, the ones he had kept, even after she left wondering if he had done enough. And yet, amid those quiet shadows, something beautiful grew. Forgiveness. Not the kind you speak out loud, the kind you live. One morning, Henry surprised her. He wheeled into the conservatory where Maggie was writing postcards to Vanessa and Lucas. I made a decision, he said. Maggie looked up. About what? The foundation. She blinked. The one from your brother's estate? He nodded. I'm naming it after you. She paused. What? It'll be called the Margaret Foundation, he said plainly. It'll fund scholarships for women returning to education after 40. You'd be amazed how many of them gave up dreams to raise families, and now they're too afraid to try again. Maggie felt her throat tighten. Henry, I built my company from the ground up, he said. But I never would have survived that first decade if I didn't have strong women around me, some who believed in me, some who left, some who reminded me who I was. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder. I want you to lead it. Be the face of it. Speak at events. Pick the recipients. You're not just part of my life, Maggie. You are the legacy. She opened the folder. Inside, her name Margaret Whitmore typed across the header of the first draft proposal. She looked at him, speechless. Are you sure? She finally whispered. I've never been more sure. Tears gathered in her eyes. Then, with a smile that wavered but didn't fall, she said, Then let's do it. Let's help them become who they're meant to be. Henry grinned. That's my sunshine. That night, For the first time since they returned from Pine Hollow, Maggie slept without dreams. Because sometimes healing doesn't come through words. It comes through purpose. The first frost came early that year. It swept across the hills of Eureka Springs like a whisper, dusting the rooftops in white and turning the garden beds brittle overnight. Maggie stood by the kitchen window that morning, her breath fogging the glass as she cradled her mug of tea. She had always loved this time of year, the quiet between fall's blaze and winter's hush. But this time, something felt different. Henry was sleeping later, reading less, smiling, but not with the same spark. At first, she chalked it up to the colder weather. He was, after all, in his 70s. And she wasn't exactly a spring chicken. But then came the moments, the slips. He'd pause mid-sentence, searching for a word he once used without effort. Or forget whether they had taken tea that morning, even as the empty cup sat beside him. She said nothing at first. She wanted to believe it was nothing. Until the night he stood in the conservatory, staring at the glass with a look that chilled her more than any winter air. "Henry," she called softly. He didn't answer. She approached, laid a hand on his shoulder. He turned slowly, and for a brief, terrible second, just 1 second, she saw confusion in his eyes. Not the kind born from distraction, the kind born from disorientation. As if, just for a moment, he wasn't sure who she was. Then it passed. His smile returned. And so did his words. But Maggie didn't forget. She called Dr. Solomon the next morning, Henry's neurologist in Little Rock, a cautious man with a soft voice and eyes that had seen too much. "He's due for a scan anyway," Dr. Solomon said gently. "Let's move the appointment up." Maggie waited until after breakfast to mention it. Henry didn't argue, but he didn't meet her eyes either. "I've felt off," he admitted. "Not broken, just foggy." "We'll get answers," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. He smiled weakly. "And if the answers are ones we don't like, then we'll face them together." The scan came on a rainy Thursday. The waiting room smelled of lemon, disinfectant, and damp coats. Maggie held Henry's hand as they sat in silence, the only sound the occasional rattle of an old radiator. Dr. Solomon returned with a folder and a tight smile. "It's early," he said, "but there are signs. Mild cognitive impairment, possibly early-stage Alzheimer's. We can't say for certain without further progression, but..." The word hung in the air like mist. Alzheimer's. Maggie felt her world shift. Not shatter, but tilt, like the floor was no longer level beneath her. She listened carefully. Medications. Monitoring. DEET. Sleep. "The good news is," Dr. Solomon continued, "Henry's physical health is strong. His mind is still mostly clear. With structure and familiarity, he could hold steady for a long time. But the unspoken truth lingered. It would get worse. Slowly. Steadily. Irrevocably." That night, Maggie sat in the study, alone. Henry had gone to bed early. She stared at the fire, the letter from Pine Hollow still tucked in the drawer beside her. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. She had always known life could be cruel, but this felt like betrayal. Just when they had found each other again, just when they had finally said all the things that once went unsaid, now time was threatening to steal him memory by memory, word by word. She refused to let fear take root. But grief? Grief curled inside her chest like a quiet visitor, waiting for permission to stay. In the days that followed, Maggie adjusted. She created new routines, little rituals that gave their days shape and structure. Breakfast at 8, walks at 10, reading after lunch, music in the evenings. She labeled drawers, color-coded pill bottles, left sticky notes in soft blue handwriting that read, "The sugar is in the second cabinet. Lucas is your grandson. You are loved." Some days, Henry didn't need them. Other days, he thanked her with a shy sort of embarrassment. "I'm still me," he said once, trying to smile. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I'm staying close." They attended Sunday service every week, held hands in the pew, smiled at neighbors, pretended nothing had changed. But at night, Maggie sometimes found him standing by the window, staring out at the garden with his hand on the glass. When she asked what he was thinking, he'd say, "I don't want to forget your name." And she would hold him so tight, as if the strength of her arms could anchor his memory in place. Then came a gift. A small, unassuming box from Vanessa and Lucas, delivered by mail. Inside was a scrapbook handmade, with fabric corners and thick pages. On the cover, embroidered words, "For when you forget and need to remember." The pages were filled with photos, old and new. Henry as a boy on a fishing dock, Maggie in her wedding dress, Lucas with frosting on his nose, snapshots of them in the conservatory, at the cafe in Pine Hollow, at the foundation launch, dancing slowly beneath golden leaves. Each photo labeled, each memory captured. Henry held it like a sacred text. "This," he whispered, "is everything." Maggie cried in the kitchen that night. Not because she was sad, but because love, real love, was still finding ways to hold them. Even as the fog rolled in, if you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. The morning of the foundation gala arrived with an early snowfall. Fat flakes drifted lazily across the sky, blanketing Eureka Springs in soft white, as if the town itself had dressed in its best for the occasion. Inside the Whitmore estate, the air buzzed with quiet excitement. Volunteers fluttered about the ballroom like bees, arranging candles, tying satin ribbons to name cards, checking lighting for the video projector. It would be the first official event of the Margaret Foundation, and the first time many in town would hear Maggie speak publicly. "You nervous?" Patricia asked, gently adjusting the neckline of Maggie's deep blue gown. "A little," Maggie admitted, watching her reflection. "It's been a long time since I stood in front of a room and told my story." "You've lived it with grace," Patricia said, smiling. "Now you just have to speak it." In the hallway, Henry was waiting wearing a tailored black suit with a silver tie. He looked regal, proud, and slightly distracted. Maggie noticed the paper in his hand. "What's that?" she asked. He blinked, as if surprised to see it. "My speech," he said. I wanted to say something tonight. For you." Maggie touched his hand. "You don't have to if you're not up for it." "I want to," he said firmly. "Even if I forget halfway through, I'll remember the beginning." That evening, the ballroom filled with over 100 guests, donors, press, old colleagues, friends from Pine Hollow, local students, and their families. Everyone seated at round tables under soft amber light. At the head table sat Maggie and Henry, hand in hand, hearts beating in sync. When it came time, the MC tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the woman behind the vision, the one whose story inspired it all. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore." Maggie stood slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the stage, but her eyes were calm. She told them about second chances, about raising a daughter and losing herself along the way, about returning to work not out of ambition, but survival, and about finding love again, not the way movies promised it, but the kind that endures. She ended with this: "If you are over 50 and feel like life has passed you by, please hear me. It hasn't. Sometimes the best chapters come after the ones you thought were final. And sometimes love, real, gentle, redemptive love, arrives not to save you, but to remind you that you were never lost." The room rose in applause. Tears shimmered in the corners of many eyes, Henry's most of all. When the clapping died down, the MC smiled again. "And now, to close our program tonight, a few words from Mr. Henry Whitmore." The applause rose again, softer this time, reverent. Henry wheeled forward slowly, paper still in hand, though he didn't look at it. He set it on the podium, but never glanced down. He looked at Maggie, only her, and he began. "I was a builder, not of buildings of business. I measured success in numbers, forecasts, growth. But the older I got, the more I realized I hadn't built the one thing that mattered, a life worth remembering," until she walked back in. He paused, swallowed. The room was so quiet, one could hear the creak of the podium as he shifted his weight. Maggie didn't save me. She saw me. And in a world where everyone wants to be impressive, to be remembered, being seen is the rarest gift of all. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "If one day I forget your name, love, Just know, even when the words leave me, the feeling never will. And if I forget how we met, how we danced in the conservatory, or how the cherry pie tasted in Pine Hollow, just read me the letter, the one I wrote in 1975, and remind me that love waits. It always waits. The crowd stood again, applauding but not loudly, gently, as if to hold the moment without breaking it. Maggie rose and walked to the stage, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I'll remember for both of us." And Henry whispered back, "I know." Later that night, long after the last guest had left and the candles had burned low, Maggie found Henry in the garden, sitting quietly beneath the bare oak tree. Snow dotted his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice. She wrapped a blanket around him and sat beside his chair, pulling his hand into her lap. "You did beautifully," she said. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid I'd forget halfway. But you didn't." "No," he said, "because you were there. You always bring me back." She rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long time they sat in silence, two old souls beneath a winter sky, wrapped in each other. Maggie knew the road ahead would not be easy. But she also knew this. Love did not live in memory alone. It lived in touch, in Gaza, in the steady rhythm of presence. She would not mourn him before he was gone. She would walk with him every step. Even when the path blurred, even when the leaves had all fallen, she would walk hand in hand through whatever winter came. It began subtly. Henry stopped asking for the crossword puzzle at breakfast. He no longer played Nat King Cole on the record player unless Maggie turned it on first, and he stopped remembering what day of the week it was. Maggie kept smiling. She kept routines, kept labeling things, kept reading to him at night, even when his eyes drifted away from the page and toward a horizon only he could see. Then came the morning he didn't recognize the conservatory. He sat on the velvet settee, the one they'd danced beside only weeks earlier, and stared out at the frost-laced windows. "It's beautiful," he murmured, then turned to Maggie and asked, "Whose house is this?" Her hands didn't tremble, though her heart did. "It's ours, love," she said, kneeling beside him. "We built it. Together." He nodded slowly. "It feels safe." That night, after he fell asleep, Maggie stepped outside and let herself cry for the first time in weeks, not out of panic, but release. The next morning, Maggie walked into Patricia's office with a stack of folders. "Are those the applications?" Patricia asked, looking up. Maggie nodded. "For next year's scholarship round. I've read through all 82. Patricia blinked. "All of them?" "Every word." She sat down, smoothing the edges of the top file. "These women," she said softly, "they're not just chasing degrees. They're chasing dignity. And I'm not letting them go unseen." Patricia leaned forward. "You're carrying a lot right now." "I know," Maggie said. "But it's not weight. It's purpose." She paused, then looked up. "I want to hand leadership of the foundation to Lucas next year." Patricia tilted her head. "Are you sure?" "He's been volunteering every weekend. He already mentors 2 of the applicants. He believes in this work." "And Henry?" Maggie smiled sadly. "Henry believes in him." She pulled out a second envelope. "And I want to turn the story, our story, into a book. Not a memoir. A collection of lessons. About aging. About love that endures. About starting again after 70. Patricia exhaled. "You don't slow down, do you?" Maggie chuckled. "I don't know how." That evening, Lucas arrived with a chocolate cake and his usual grin. "Hey, Grandma," he said, pulling her into a hug. "How's the smartest woman I know?" She tousled his hair. Flatterer. Henry lit up when he saw him, his eyes clearer for a while, like something familiar clicked into place. "Lucas," he said warmly. "You grew again." Lucas chuckled. "I've been 6'2" for 3 years, Grandpa." Henry blinked, then laughed. "Time plays tricks, doesn't it?" They had dinner together, the 4 of them, and it almost felt normal. Until dessert, when Henry suddenly looked at Maggie and asked, "Have we met?" The table fell quiet. Lucas reached over gently. "It's okay, Grandpa." But Henry looked at Maggie again, studying her as if she were a song he couldn't quite hum. "You seem important," he said softly. Maggie swallowed hard, then took his hand. "I am." she whispered. To you, I'm very important. Henry nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then I'm not afraid. Later that night, after Lucas left and Henry had fallen asleep, Maggie sat at her desk. She opened a fresh journal. On the first page, she wrote, There will come a day when he forgets our first kiss, our first fight, the cherry pie, the conservatory dance. But I will remember for both of us. And maybe someday someone like Lucas will read these pages and understand that love is not what we say. Love is what we carry when the words fade and only presence remains. Asterisk. She closed the journal, lit a candle, and whispered into the night, You're still here. And that's enough for today. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. It was Lucas's idea. You always talked about the sea, Grandma, he said one afternoon while helping Maggie sort foundation letters. Maybe you and Grandpa should go. One last time. Maggie smiled faintly. He's not the same anymore, Lucas. Lucas leaned forward, voice soft. But the ocean hasn't changed. And maybe it remembers him. Maggie looked out the window for a long moment, then nodded. They left for the coast 3 days later. Lucas drove. It was a quiet ride, Henry staring out the window, occasionally asking where they were going, occasionally smiling at a tree he thought he'd seen before. But when the salt in the air grew thicker, when the flat Arkansas road finally gave way to the sweeping shores of Galveston, something lit up behind his eyes. I know this, he whispered. Maggie squeezed his hand. Yes, she said. You do. They stayed at a small inn by the water. White shutters, creaky floors, a breakfast room that smelled of pancakes and old lace. Henry sat on the porch swing that first evening, watching the sun slide into the Gulf like a melting coin. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. Maggie sat beside him, fingers laced with his. The breeze toyed with her scarf, and for a long time the only sound was waves meeting shore. Finally, he turned to her. You're familiar, he said softly. But I don't remember why. Maggie smiled. Because you loved me once, she said. Henry frowned slightly, as if struggling to hold the thought. Then slowly, almost shyly, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers. Still do, he murmured. And she believed him. The next morning, Lucas brought them down to the beach. It was nearly empty, just the distant sound of gulls, the sea stretching wide and silver beneath the overcast sky. Henry walked slowly, leaning on Maggie's arm. Ach, step unsertin. Each breath measured. But when he reached the water, he let go, stepped barefoot into the shallows, and laughed. Not loudly, just softly, like a child rediscovering something sacred. Maggie stayed back, watching. The man she loved stood in the ocean, arms open, eyes closed. And for a few beautiful minutes, he looked like the boy he once was. That evening, Maggie sat on the balcony alone. Henry had fallen asleep early, more tired than usual, more distant. Lucas brought her tea, then paused before walking away. I know it's not the same, he said, but I think he knew. Today, at the beach. Maggie nodded. I think so too. Lucas hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from his jacket. I found this in his desk last week, he said. It's addressed to you. Maggie took it, heart suddenly heavy. Inside was a single card. A drawing, a sketch Henry must have made weeks ago. Crude but unmistakable. It was of her, sitting in the conservatory, knitting. On the back, just 3 words. You are home. Maggie pressed the card to her heart and let the tears come. That night, a storm rolled in. Not harsh, just enough to make the wind groan through the window panes. Maggie lay awake beside Henry, listening to his breathing. Steady, soft. She turned toward him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. I'm still here, she whispered. And I always will be. He didn't reply, but a faint smile touched his lips. At dawn, the innkeeper found Maggie still in bed, Henry's hand in hers. Her eyes were closed, but she was awake, watching the sky turn from silver to pale pink. And Henry was at peace. His breathing had stilled. His hand was warm no longer, but his face was calm, like the tide had finally carried him someplace safe. The funeral was small. Maggie didn't want fanfare. Just the sea. They scattered his ashes beneath the same oak tree where they'd kissed in Pine Hollow, and some into the Gulf, where the waves had once welcomed him like an old friend. Lucas stood beside her the whole time. No speeches, just silence, just memory. And then Maggie turned to the sea one last time and whispered, "You were home to me too." 1 week later, she returned to Eureka Springs and walked into the offices of the Margaret Foundation. She greeted each staff member by name, asked about their children, their gardens, their aging parents. Then she entered the boardroom and handed Lucas a folder. "I'm stepping down," she said. Lucas blinked. "Grandma, you're ready." He opened the folder. Inside, a transition plan, new scholarships, an endowment for memory care education, and a final note in Maggie's handwriting. "Let this foundation be not just about second chances, but about final chapters written with dignity, about love that outlives forgetting, and about holding the ones we love, even when they begin to slip away." Lucas closed the folder. "I'll make you proud." Maggie smiled. "You already have." That evening, Maggie returned home. She made tea, Saturday in the conservatory, and opened her journal. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Today I said goodbye, but not to Henry, only to the part of him the world could see. The rest, the laughter, the kindness, the softness of his hands, lives in every cup of tea, in every woman who dares to begin again, and in every wave that reaches the shore and reminds us, nothing truly loved is ever lost. Asterisk." She closed the book, lit a candle, and whispered, "Good night, my love." Spring arrived quietly. No sudden blooms, no parades of daffodils, just the gentle thaw of soil, the patient unfolding of buds, and the kind of light that lingers longer each evening, not bold, but certain. Maggie rose each day with purpose, but no longer with urgency. She walked slower, spoke softer, and listened more. Lucas had taken the foundation to places even she hadn't imagined. The new Women's Center opened in Tulsa last month. A young mother from Missouri just received full funding from medical school, and next fall, they'd begin offering creative writing scholarships in Henry's name. The past had not disappeared. It had simply settled into the soil, into the stories, into the hearts of those still walking. One Sunday, after church, Maggie visited the garden. The conservatory had been turned into a public reading room, now Henry's idea, just before he forgot the word library. He had simply pointed and said, "A place for stories." And so, it became one. Inside, the shelves were lined with books, not just literature, but letters, journals, sketches, memoirs, voices of those who, like Henry and Maggie, had once feared it was too late to begin again, too late to be known, too late to love. But they'd written anyway. And now, the stories waited for someone else to find them. Maggie took her usual seat by the west window. Outside, a mother read to her child on a blanket. Further down the path, an elderly man offered sunflower seeds to a squirrel. Life went on, not in spite of grief, but alongside it. She opened her journal, not to write, this time, but to reread. Pages of her and Henry's journey, captured in ink, moments that had nearly been lost to time, but weren't, because she remembered, because she chose to. On the final page, she had once written, "If he forgets my name, I will speak it for both of us. If he forgets our story, I will carry it like a lantern, lighting the path back home." She ran her fingers over the words. Still true, still enough. That afternoon, as she left the conservatory, a young woman stopped her near the steps. "Excuse me," the girl said shyly, holding a book to her chest. "Are you Mrs. Whitmore?" Maggie smiled. "I am. I wanted to say thank you. I'm one of the writing fellows. Your story, the one in the reading room, it made me call my grandmother for the first time in 5 years." Madge's heart caught. She cried when she heard my voice, the girl continued. "And all I could think about was you and Henry. I don't know if I'll ever have a love like that. But I know now it's not too late to begin again." Maggie reached out and touched her arm. "Then you've already begun," she said. That night, she lit a candle on the windowsill, something she did each spring equinox. Not for grief, but gratitude. Gratitude for the love that came back, for the man who stayed as long as he could, for the words they left behind, and for the sacred, quiet truth that the seasons turn, but love remains. In the hush of her home, Maggie whispered once more, "Thank you, Henry, for remembering me, even when you forgot." If this story touched something in your heart, a memory, a silence, or a wound left by someone you love, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the hardest people to forgive are the ones closest to us. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the pain didn't happen. It means choosing not to pass that pain on. It means saying, "You may have hurt me, but you don't get to shape who I become." In this story, Maggie was hurt by her own daughter. She was abandoned when she needed love the most. But she chose not to harden. She chose grace. Because forgiveness, especially within family, isn't weakness. It's wisdom. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is love without a guarantee. So if you've ever had to forgive a child, a parent, or someone who once held your trust, you're not alone. And your story may be the light someone else needs. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and come back next week for another soul-touching story. Because healing begins where judgment ends. And it's never too late to forgive, to love again, to begin again.